Do we admit all?
Yeah, just doing it, Georgia.
Oh, Tam has just said the link's not working.
Welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me, and we're going to start shortly. I'm going to just start by giving a bit of an intro to this webinar. I'm really pleased to have everybody here. So I'm Francesca Albanese. I'm the Director of Policy and Social Change at Crisis. And this is the first of a series of 3 webinars that we're doing on the subject of racism and homelessness. And I'm really pleased to be presenting alongside a lot of the team who contributed to the research report that Crisis published last month. We're also running these webinars alongside 2 organisations who we're doing this in collaboration with. So that's both the Race Equality Foundation and also iSphere at Heriot-Watt University. And I'll be talking a little bit more at the end about kind of what you can expect next from the webinar series. But just to begin with, I wanted to give a bit of an overview about kind of why we've done this piece of research, and you'll hear a lot more about that from the researchers themselves. So I think many of you who are on this webinar will know that this has been an evidence gap for quite a long time in terms of how we look at the disproportionality around race and homelessness and what that means in terms of solutions. And so for Crisis, we were very conscious that we wanted to add to the evidence base on this area, alongside many other organisations who are doing a huge amount of work in this space. And so our research very much centred on the stories behind the statistics, and looking at kind of how we can understand more about the experiential issues that there are within the current housing and homelessness system and what contributes to homelessness from the lens of race and racism. I'm going to, when we have each speaker, they're going to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to move on now very quickly, just to give a bit of context as to where we've situated this research. So thank you, Georgia. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So I think many people attending the webinar will be very conscious of the context that we're all working in. And so across England, Scotland and Wales at the moment, we know that nearly all forms of homelessness are rising. And this graph here is for England, and it's about the level of temporary accommodation placements that have been happening over the last 10 years. And as you can see, there's a substantial growth in those. And we have the same situation happening in Scotland and Wales at the moment as well. And, you know, for many of you who are working either directly in homelessness services or supporting people who are experiencing homelessness, you will be very aware of the urgency of the issue that we all face at the moment. Georgia, can you move on to the next slide, please? But I think what is really clear is there definitely is a disproportionate risk of homelessness among certain groups. And so this table is taken from my colleagues at Heriot-Watt University have done a really in-depth piece of research called The State of the Nation. If anyone wants to know more about the quantitative and statistical kind of elements of how we understand race and racism within the homelessness system, I would really recommend you reading that. And what you can see from here is that different groups from Black and minoritised ethnic communities experience homelessness disproportionately. So there is a notable disproportionality amongst Black households, particularly when applying for as homeless within the statutory system, but also when that's combined with what we call core homeless, which includes things like sofa surfing. There's a much increased disproportionality there, and we see that across different groups. So I think the other thing to note here is one of the things we were really wanted to do is make sure that we looked at how homelessness affects different people with different circumstances, because we know that when we're talking about race and racism within homelessness and housing, it isn't a homogenous problem, and it has a lot of nuances. And so very much what we wanted to do with this piece of research is make sure that we drew out that. I've also realised I didn't do any housekeeping at the beginning. I'm very sorry, everybody. So just to say, we are recording this, and we've also got the Q&A function going. So if you do have a question as we kind of go along the findings, please do put them in the chat. And I'm now going to pass it over to Georgia.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So just to introduce myself, I'm Georgia Leith. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at Crisis in the research team, and I was part of this project in its final stages. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the sort of review of what was out there in the early stages of the journey of this research showed about the housing system in Great Britain being racialised. There were wide and varying sources of evidence that showed that there was an overrepresentation of people from Black and minoritized ethnic communities. And altogether, those pieces of research are all pointed towards the whole system really being disproportionately racialized for people from minoritized ethnic groups. What I've demonstrated in this slide is at the far end of the housing system, people living in accommodation, people from Black and minoritized ethnic groups are overrepresented in terms of living in overcrowded housing, living in housing that is deemed unaffordable, and also facing and being evicted from accommodation in the private rented sector. Then also in terms of the in people approaching their local authority for support when facing or experiencing homelessness, again, disproportionately high numbers of Black and minoritized ethnic communities. And then at the really sharp end of the housing system, with people experiencing homelessness, again, disproportionality in terms of people living in temporary accommodation, people being housed in temporary accommodation away from their local area, and also disproportionately in terms of rough sleeping. So even though all these different pieces of research show something different, altogether they paint a picture of a housing system that disproportionately affects people from minoritized ethnic backgrounds in Great Britain. And as one of our community researchers summarised so eloquently, race defines the housing outcomes of millions of people in Great Britain today. So I'm now going to hand over to the researcher who was part of Crisis at the time, and community researchers. Over to you, Michael, for this next bit.
Thanks, Georgia. So my name is Michael Allard. I was one of the researchers involved with this project. I've not been at Crisis in the last year, but really happy to kind of be back here to talk about this really important piece of research. So when we were kind of deciding on what exactly to do in the context of this quite widespread evidence about there being a kind of racialized housing and homelessness system, and these quite sort of clear indicators of systemic disproportionality and discrimination, there were kind of a lot of options on the table, but a kind of key thing that we really wanted to bring out was what are the real kind of experiences and stories that individuals who have been homeless and who identify as people of color or as being from a minority ethnic group, well, what have they really kind of been through, and how do these trends play out in an individual's life? And at the time of scoping out and starting this research, it was just after the COVID pandemic. We just had that kind of context of, on the one hand, rising homelessness, but also kind of improved sort of solutions for dealing with homelessness, and that was a kind of new context in which we thought would be really interesting to explore this. But then, whenever you go into this topic and think about it, you actually have to think about something quite historical as well. And, you know, we ended up interviewing and working with people who had themselves been homeless or had been in poor forms of housing at different points in their life, and sometimes at very early points in their life as well. So what we wanted to do was both to look at the kind of present day and what was happening kind of right now in people's lives, and particularly for people who are experiencing homelessness at the moment, but also to take a look at kind of personal histories as well, and what had happened earlier in their life on top of that. But the kind of second objective that we were really interested in was really drawing attention to these links between racism and homelessness. So rather than kind of sort of posing these kind of distant questions about, well, what are the links between what we're seeing in these statistics in people's lives, let's actually talk to people as individuals about their experiences of racism, how they see both how racism has affected their lives and any experiences of housing and homelessness, both in kind of quite direct ways, but also in these wider, maybe more structural or indirect ways as well, and really have that kind of conversation and debate within the research. And then the other side of it that we felt was really important was that doing research like this, it's really important to really kind of enable and platform the voices of people who are often ignored and who have been through these experiences themselves. So that's both about kind of highlighting an individual's lived experience, letting people tell their stories, but also trying to see other ways in which what we're doing can be shaped and be open to the views and perspectives, not just of crisis, but of other people as well. And I'm really pleased that we're joined by a couple of the community researchers who had relevant personal experiences that they brought to this kind of research. And I'd really like to hear from them as well about what they saw as kind of their own motivation to be involved. I don't know if Tam, if you wanted to go first, maybe if you could introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about why you decided to get involved in this project.
Hi everyone, I'm Tamana Mia. I'm Kent. I'm a community researcher, and I was really delighted to be a part of this project. It meant a lot to me to be part of this project. There's not often that people are doing projects on homelessness and ethnic minorities and discrimination and racism. And I thought, actually, having had personal experience of racism and discrimination myself, and having gone through homelessness issues, that I would really like to give back to the community and the wider community of those young people and those that are from different backgrounds, minorities, and so on and so forth. And especially throughout COVID times, there was a lot of issues around homelessness and discrimination and racism. A lot of people, a lot of families were struggling to get the help and access and support that they needed. So actually, I wanted to reflect on what happened during COVID, pre, post, and during COVID. So that's why I thought it was really important to work with Crisis to make sure that actually we can bring about positive change.
Thanks, Tam. And if Silong is there, did you want to jump in and talk a little bit about yourself and any kind of particular reasons you had for joining this research?
Hi, I'm Silong. My pronouns are they, them. And for me, similar to Tam in the sense that like I have lived experiences as well. I've been involved in peer research in the past, and I think it's a really great way to kind of emphasize the importance of lived experience knowledges. Not just to fit a dominant narrative, because I think sometimes there's this sort of stigmatization as who is classed as homeless and who can be homeless, but to challenge those dominant narratives through lived experiences and recognize that that sort of lived experience knowledge is just as important as statistics. And then passing on to whoever's next.
Thanks, Silong. And just to acknowledge as well, I can see that in the audience, we've got some of the other kind of team members here, which is really, really nice for you to be back. Now, on the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the approach that we took to kind of answering these questions. So at the kind of core of this research, we decided that we wanted to do essentially interviews with people who identify as being a person of color or from a minority ethnic group and having been through homelessness or other forms of insecure and precarious housing that, depending on your definition, you might describe as homeless, you might not, but we wanted to take quite an inclusive approach to that topic. And I think in the end, on balance, I think the majority of people we talked to were experiencing homelessness at the time, but as I mentioned, some it was a more of a kind of past or recent experience. And we spoke to, I think it was 58 people in the end in total, and we saw that kind of interview approach as essentially being the best way to get at personal experiences, stories, but also individual perspectives on the links between racism and homelessness, to quite big, difficult challenges that may kind of play a joined up role in someone's life, but might not. And those interviews were done in a mixture of ways. We did some of them in person by going to relevant kind of day centres, speaking to members of Crisis as well when they were visiting our service. But quite a lot was done on over the phone as well, which posed some interesting challenges we might kind of come back to. Generally, we did those interviews for about an hour, though there were longer and shorter ones, and talked to people about, just their background and identity, their living situations, how they kind of had become homeless, and where they saw kind of experiences of racism and their identity fitting in with all these things, if at all. And we wanted to take what we've kind of referred to already as a kind of community research approach. There's other terms for describing that kind of research used, such as peer research. It's also called citizen science by some people. But at the heart of it, what you're doing is, rather than it being a sort of traditional model where you have a professional researcher who is going to talk to people about a really difficult and sensitive topic, is you're actually bringing in people who have those experiences that you want to talk to be their part of the research process. So people with lived experience of homelessness, housing insecurity, and racism were involved in doing the research itself, as well as being participants in it. So we advertised what we were doing quite widely, and we found that there were people who were using different homelessness centres and services, around the country, who wanted to be involved, and actively kind of interested in talking about, the relationship between racism and housing and homelessness. And that was how we sort of connected with Ceylon, Samana, and others who are kind of here today. I don't know if Tam or Ceylon, you wanted to kind of build a little bit and say what some of the kind of tasks that you kind of took part in, what the ways in which you were involved, and how you kind of found that. Samana, did you want to go first, maybe?
Yeah, so we had a range of tasks. We were involved in regular meetings. We were working with Power With, who were also facilitating the sessions. It was really, really positive experience working with Power With, actually. They had so much experience and knowledge and advice and guidance and support to give us. They would regularly check in with us. And it was just a really good experience working with them, as well as with Crisis as well. We were involved in making the questions, we were involved in the consultations, we were involved as researchers, interviewing the participants. We were also participants ourselves. So we had like a really well-rounded involvement process.
Thanks. Ceylon, was there anything else that you kind of involved with that you wanted to kind of add onto that you can remember?
I think Tam just about covered it, to be honest. Thanks, Tam.
And thank you as well, Tam, for mentioning Power With, who are our partner in a lot of this work and helped to facilitate a lot of meetings that we had with the kind of wider Experts by Experience panel. We also worked with expert citizens who helped to provide training to people who didn't have research experience. And yeah, it's worth saying that so many of the interviews conducted on this project were done directly by people who had personal experience of the topic area. There were also kind of ways in which community researchers help to contact people to take part in the research, which is one of the other kind of big benefits of doing work like this, is talking to people who you might not normally speak to in research, as well as kind of perhaps getting a different interview than you would have done if it had just been me doing lots of interviews.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to focus a little bit now on the next section, which is on findings and reflections from those findings from the interviews that were conducted. Just a top line representation of the interviewees who participated. We got quite a geographical spread, but mainly London is well represented, as is the Black people who identified as Black, and a relatively equal mix of male to females. I recommend that you read the findings in full. I'm just putting a link to the findings because then you'll be able to see everything we found But what we want to do for this webinar is summarise the findings through in a different way to how they are in the report. So we're going to pull out a few themes. So firstly, just to explain that the research report itself takes apart the transcripts from the interviews and rearranges them into different themes and areas. There are also a few case studies in the report itself, but the report talks about parts of lots of people's stories, and these composite pieces of the stories that people shared with us in interviews build up a picture. We have summarised in the report itself around these themes, firstly about the experiences of racism among people of colour who have been homeless, and how people's stories about how racism causes homelessness. So really understanding that link between experiencing racism and then experiencing homelessness, also how racism was prolonging people's homelessness experiences, making it harder to leave homelessness behind. Also, that they talked about how they were accessing homelessness support and how that was for them. And then also ending the interviews with how the interviewees were navigating their way through and what was helping them do this, what sources of support they were drawing on, and how they made a difference for them. People talked about overt racism and implicit racism throughout their lives before leading up to their homelessness experience, as well as while they were seeking help. So what we're keen to do here now is focus on some observations that came through in the research. I'm going to hand over to Silong, who is going to talk through a particular observation. I hand over to you, Silong.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Georgia. So what you may see in the report, I think it's chapter 3 in particular, it separates out the different sort of systems that show up in people's stories and what they told us during our interviews. However, it's really important to note that actually, like, these different systems that show up in people's stories, like, they aren't separate. So you can see here we have housing, policing and justice, like the criminal justice system, employment, education, healthcare, and immigration. The reality of the situation is that all these different systems are interconnected in people's experiences, and they really put pressure on people of color and people who've been marginalized due to race and different intersecting identities as well, such as being queer. And it shows up in all areas of life, and it's creating the conditions for these lived experiences of homelessness, as well as maintaining those experiences as well. So experiences of policing and the criminal justice system at an early age, experiences of incarceration, and how this all feeds into also experiences of employment and education, how you are looked at school, and how your experiences of education go on to like affect your prospects due to being racialized in these systems. So it's all interconnected, and it leads us to really like demand the need for an intersectional framework. So not just in the sense of we're understanding this additive model of different identities, such as being racialized and queer or disabled, but seeing how these different systems intersect to shape people's experiences. You know, somebody's experiences of being a Black woman, for instance, like intersectionality comes from that. And how these different systems then put that pressure on people and lead to these experiences of homelessness and houselessness. So it's really important to use that framework and also get these different actors who are working in these different systems to respond to this situation and these conditions in a way that is collaborative and works together, instead of seeing the homelessness sector as something that is separate. And I think that really comes through in people's stories. I hope that kind of answers that part, and I'll pass these on to the next slide.
Thank you so much, Silong. And so something else that we pulled out of the report itself was some examples of interviewees describing the racism that they'd experienced throughout their journey into homelessness and through the homelessness system. So the interviews with people for this research sort of illustrated racial discrimination through their whole journey, making their living situation worse, keeping them in housing conditions that didn't meet their needs, not getting the support that they were entitled to, and having to jump through additional hoops. These are some examples that I've pulled out, and they're only partial representation of the experiences of all of the participants who took part. But for example, there were examples that interviewees gave about getting no support or inadequate support from their housing provider when they were experiencing racist abuse from other residents in the housing that they were in. There were stories of people feeling like they were unable to advocate for themselves in terms of what they were, what their needs were for housing, because they were so conscious of wanting to avoid being racially stereotyped and then having a more ineffective service, or the support being then harder to access. There were also examples of people who had been allocated housing or temporary accommodation in areas where they were at risk of intersecting racist harassment or ostracism. And then there were also stories people shared with us about being required to provide proof of their citizenship status, which was an extra hurdle in them getting access to the housing that they needed, despite there being no question around whether they were a UK citizen or not. So that's just a quick summary of some of the examples. Tam, if you're still there, I'd like to invite you to add to this, something you'd like to do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Ah, yes. Hi.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. We've done this research because we want to make a difference to these people's lives. We want to make sure that, you know, racism and homelessness is eliminated, and we want to ensure that the government really pays attention to our research. We've done a lot of hard work in interviewing participants and talking to a lot of people's stories, understanding people's mental health issues, personal issues. A lot of people really struggled throughout COVID and post-COVID, you know, whether it was mental health issues, whether it was domestic violence, bullying, discrimination from housing providers, charities. There's so many issues that people faced throughout COVID and post-COVID that people never really came to many resolutions, and they didn't have the support to even move on from COVID or even be able to navigate the housing system. Because the housing system is really, really quite a difficult system to play through, especially if you can't speak English, you can't read or write, English is not your first language, if you've got mental health issues, physical health issues, you're disabled, so many issues. It's really difficult to navigate the housing system, especially if you're not a professional working in it, you don't have experience of it. There's a lot of nuances and discrimination that does take place, whether it's physical discrimination, verbal discrimination, or even direct or indirect discrimination. People can get away with it, and often it takes people to go through the process of complaining through a ombudsman or even getting the court system involved. So it's a very, very challenging process, and it can have an effect on your physical and mental health well-being.
Thank you so much. Okay, and now we're going to move on to a bit of time now where Michael and Tam and Silong are invited to reflect on some of the interviews that really stood out for them, that really resonated with them, and what we can learn from those interviews and why they were so poignant. So can I hand over to you, Michael?
Sure thing. As we were saying before, the way we did these interviews was a kind of a mixture of interviews that were in person and interviews that were kind of done either over the phone or over video calls like this. I had the sort of privilege of being able to join Taman and Silong and others doing interviews, as well as doing interviews myself. And we wanted to just reflect on kind of a few of our experiences of interviews that stood out to us, both in terms of the stories, but as well as what the experience was like of interviewing some of the people who we talked to. To Mana, first of all, that when we had a chat last week, we talked about a couple of interviews that you did and that I got to kind of observe. One that you've I mean, but both presented challenges, but there was one that in various ways was particularly challenging, and one that sort of went a bit better as a kind of research interview goes. So maybe starting with the one that didn't go as well. If I remember right, this was an interview with someone who was living in Scotland in social housing, but was facing harassment from people in their area, some of which was quite racist in nature, and they actually didn't feel safe there anymore. And that was one of the reasons why they were effectively becoming homeless and had to move to temporary accommodation. But then were struggling to get somewhere more secure, meaning that they had these quite difficult choices between unstable temporary accommodation or a home that is in theory more stable, but actually was one that was quite sort of felt unsafe. And I was wondering if you could, yeah, share anything that you remember about that interview, anything you found difficult about it or that you enjoyed about it. And there was another one as well, which we can come back to.
Yeah, I think we did 2 interviews that really stayed with me. Mentally, I found them quite emotionally quite difficult and draining, because I felt the experiences that they had felt themselves, which I will talk about in the next slide. I think the first one was the female, who had the family and the children, and she was very a lovely lady, and she was going through a really difficult time with her children, and she was homeless, and she'd experienced being moving around. She was in a place where the neighbors were not very nice, and she was experiencing a lot of racism and discrimination. They were struggling with her children at school. Her son was having issues. Other people were being quite nasty and going through bullying and discrimination. So it's really, really difficult. Like I was saying, when you're in a country, you can't speak the language and you can't read and write, and you're not able to deal with your own affairs like financial affairs, housing affairs, day-to-day affairs, and you don't have the moral support, the family support, the relative support, friends and family. It can be really, really challenging. And if you're in an area where there's not enough funding available, there's not enough resources available, housing infrastructure available, then actually it can be really virtually impossible to get the help and support we need and to even be directed towards the right support, especially if you don't have the relevant services like, I don't know, a crisis service in your area, or even citizen advice, or if you have an MP, you contact the MP and they can't help you as much as they'd like to. So yeah, it was really, really difficult because, she was very visibly upset. And we were not fully sure on how to assist her at the time, but we did have to cut the interview short, because it was for her best interest, because she was in such a mentally difficult state of affairs that she was having difficulties with her surroundings and her neighbours and her children, that actually we realised that actually the interview took a mental toll on her, talking about her experiences of going through homelessness and discrimination. Sometimes these interviews can trigger our participants, so we have to sort of use our own judgment and think, actually, is it realistic to be able to continue with this interview? Maybe get some support. So Michael did actually stop the interview, and we managed to try and help her with some resources and support, which I'm sure she really appreciated, and we really appreciated that Michael made this decision to make sure that the interview was terminated, for her best interest. And I think she is doing much better now since the interview, but I'm sure Michael can add on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you for explaining all of that. And I think it was one of those situations where doing an interview over the phone was really tricky because we weren't in the room with this person to be able to kind of see. She was clearly upset in some ways by talking about this, and she was at home, her kids were around, and she had to interact with them in some ways during the conversation. And it was just a really tricky scenario in which, because this was someone who was actively looking for help and the help that she was getting wasn't really working, we had to sort of change tack, and it turned into a conversation more about, well, this isn't about interviewing you about your experiences, it's more about what can we do to help you, even though we're researchers and not necessarily we're linked up with people who are better at kind of providing support than we are, but having to pass someone on to someone else when they need help is always a really difficult thing, because you want to be the one, you're in the conversation with them, you want to help them. And I think that probably for someone who's not done interviews before, that might have been quite challenging as a space to kind of be in. There was another interview though, which we didn't experience that kind of challenge. It sort of went well, as kind of you hope a research interview is going to, and as most of them do. And that was with a man based in Wales, if I remember correctly. Do you want to say anything about that interview, Taman? I can add as well, anything you remember about it.
Again, two very pleasant people who'd gone through a lot of turbulence in their lives, a lot of physical and mental health struggles. It wasn't easy to talk about their situations at all, coming from an interviewer perspective, and even as a general member of the public, it was quite difficult to hear their experiences. And I had a lot of empathy and understanding and sympathy for them, as did Michael. Two very contrasted interviews. One, obviously, a young lady with her children in a housing estate, and another one who obviously was a male, sort of in his mid 40s, 50s, who'd worked in sort of military type background, sort of quite macho. He was very, very pleasant, had a lot of experiences, positive, negative. Often there is issues with mental health where people's judgment can become clouded, or they can want to kind of push their sort of experiences to the bottom. They don't want to talk about them, or they don't want to remember them. So it can be sometimes difficult to kind of get those experiences out of people, especially when the trauma does take a toll, and even the PTSD element does take a toll too. So obviously we have to use our judgment as researchers to make sure that we are sensitive as possible, and understanding that we have to have a judgment call in terms of the questions we want to ask them, and adjusting some of our questions and going sort of with the flow with the conversation to make sure that they are feeling really, really supported. Him himself, he was kind of talking about his mental health, but he didn't want to talk too much about his mental health. Again, there is a lot of stigma in mental health. As we know, 1 in 4 people have mental health issues, and it's more difficult for men, because men are seen to not want to talk about these things, because of the masculinity, and also kind of like you've got sort of the macho vibes and the strong leadership vibes. So men don't want to be seen as sort of weak and talking about their own personal issues and experiences, which is also okay. It's individual choice. However, we did understand that he tried to ask for the help that he needed. He didn't always get the help and support that he needed regarding his homelessness issues and even his mental health issues. Michael, I'm sure if you want to come and chip in, a lot more you can add.
Sure thing. Yeah, I mean, as I remember it, this was an interview with someone who, as you said, used to be in the army. He also, I think, had sort of worked in transport, and he described growing up with racism as a core kind of part of his life. He was from a mixed race background and sort of experienced name calling as a child when he was in the army, and felt that a lot of this contributed to him not being able to have a more kind of stable work, housing situation. One of the things that contributed to him sleeping rough, but also, as you've kind of talked about, this element of kind of not really knowing how to talk about mental health, and combined with the fact that he said there wasn't, he was on the streets for a long time without people coming to help him, feeling quite ignored, and it was only at this kind of a much later point in his life, around the time we were interviewing, where he'd finally kind of gotten in touch with a good set of support services, and that also for him helped him to recognize, I think, some of these challenges he'd faced about just being able to talk about challenges that he'd experienced in this life. He'd often sort of just passed off an experience of bullying as just a thing you have to live with. And I think what really stuck with me about that interview was how in itself that conversation was, I think, in some ways hopefully cathartic for him, but that's at the same time, you also have to hold this kind of difficult space in a conversation like that, where you as a researcher are being quite affected by the issues you're hearing about. So you have to sort of, and you don't know how beneficial what you're doing is to them. It's a really tricky set of dynamics to work with, even if you have an interview that goes well, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there was a big contrast between these two interviews. Obviously, the young lady, she was very open in sharing her experiences, quite from the outset, actually, her experiences, her son's experiences, but she was very emotional about her experiences because she was currently living through that experience. Whereas I think the difference with the man, obviously, he didn't want to share as much of his experiences as he'd like to. He obviously had some mental blocks when he was talking about his experience. especially because of the fact that he felt so ignored. I think that, again, there is a lot of similarities and differences between these two interviews. You know, people want to share their experience, but they also don't want to share their experience because some people feel that, you know, they have a certain, you know, honor and dignity and personal sort of confidence, self-respect, self-esteem, which is also fine too, is not a problem. But sometimes people do have a cloud in their judgment, or there's a mental block which stops them from delving deep, because I think it's to do with their trauma and PTSD that they don't want to unlock those experiences in case they get triggered and mentally upset again, and they may not have the mental space to be able to do it, or even have the mental support to be able to do it. So even having a support network is quite essential to be able to move on from these difficult experiences in homelessness, housing, you know, discrimination and mental health. Yeah, I mean, he wanted to share his experiences, but he also didn't want to share his experiences, but he also didn't have the support and the help that he needed. So it was quite a range, I think, of topics that we'd covered. And I'm really grateful for actually being a part of that, because I myself have learned so much. You know, these are two different people in two different situations from two different parts of the country, and that level of detail and insight, you wouldn't really get that on a daily basis. So I am really super grateful for these interviewees.
Thanks very much for that. And Ceylon, we also got to work together a little bit. Was there anything that you wanted to kind of share about your experience of being a community researcher, or any interviews that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I'm aware of the time, so I'll try and be brief. But yeah, I think for me, like there was one interview in particular, and it was with someone who was Black and queer and also trans. And I guess for me, it was like the multiple levels of violence and abuse that this person that I was speaking to was experiencing at the time of the interview, as well as like previously, and how that like kind of, you know, shape their experiences of homelessness and their experiences in the present too. So both historic and going on. And I think it was just, yeah, it was really hard, I think, especially when you relate to some of those experiences too. And I don't think often that those intersections are talked about enough in research around racism and homelessness, let alone queerness and racism and homelessness. And especially when you experience that sort of discrimination from your own community, for instance, like being discriminated against because of like your sexuality in addition to that, or your gender identity. And I think that was really something that stayed with me. And especially like if we look at what's going on at the moment in the UK, is like, you know, the country with the largest amount of online hate towards trans people. And in the past year alone, 350 murders of trans people, with over 93% of those being Black and brown people. So that interview has really stayed with me. And I still wonder how that person is doing today. And I guess on a kind of on the opposite kind of side of that coin, but also linked, the agency of people as well. So not seeing people who are going through these experiences of people who are passive. You know, like the person I was talking to recommended me this really great book called The Book of Homelessness, which is a collection of like art and stories that people with lived experiences put together to talk about their experiences in like almost like in a therapeutic way, but also in a really like empowering way too. And if you want to get that book, you can get that off Accumulate's website, shameless plug. But yeah, it's really great. And just that sort of element of community and chosen family, which is like people's homemaking practice when you don't have access to housing or home. Yeah, next slide.
Thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Mana at this point, who's offered to spend a couple of minutes describing her own experience and how that how she was bringing that to the community researcher role. So over to you, Tamana.
So my experiences, if everyone can hear me, I had a lot of experiences in my time going through homelessness and discrimination. I'd gone through a lot of bullying myself and discrimination as a child. I'm British, Bangladeshi Muslim. I couldn't speak English properly. I had to have a lot of help and support when I was a child. I had to have a lot of extra tuition and speech therapy myself. My family had come from Bangladesh. We'd experienced essentially a lifetime of racism and discrimination, which had an impact on our mental health and well-being. I experienced bullying and discrimination throughout school, from preschool to primary school to secondary school, sixth form, and even actually at university, where actually I thought I'd start a new lease of life at university. And actually, it was quite a life-changing experience going through racism. My housemates were very, very racist. I really, really struggled in the first year of university. I'd been in a house with different students from different parts of London and Essex. They were white British, and some of them were mixed race. And I thought actually going to university would change a lot of things, but actually it didn't. The racism was just getting worse. There was a lot of traditional types of racism, about culture and background and family and skin color, as well as sort of religious racism as well. So, throughout the times from, the 1990s, I guess, it was very focused on skin color and background. Obviously, moving on, the racism is heavily focused on religious racism and Islam, and the media and the negativity in the world, which has happened, as you guys all know, the different wars and conflicts and things that are happening in the Middle East. It does affect us. It does have a big effect on us as day-to-day British Muslims living in the United Kingdom. I would struggle a lot in terms of my housing, and I'd go to my university and ask for help and support, but they didn't really understand. They didn't recognize it. They weren't quick to act upon it. It was really quite a traumatizing experience, and it had a profound impact on my mental health, where actually I nearly didn't pass going through even first year. I had to move houses. My house was broken into in the first year. We also had my housemates, which were causing a really difficult time to my mental health. I'd have housemates that would get up to really horrible, horrible things. They wouldn't allow me to have my friends and colleagues come with me. They would even steal things from them, like, for example, their car keys, and they put them in the washing machine. And it was really quite horrible, immature behavior. They'd see things like my drinks and my personal items, and they'd mix things in, which is not right, like things like liquids and bleaches and things. So it was quite vicious, outward racism. Or even things if you'd be like cooking and cleaning, and they'd always complain about the smell of curry and things like that. So it was really quite a mentally difficult time, and I had to move houses multiple times. I was at university for 5 years. It had such an impact on my physical and mental health that it actually made me signed off sick for a lot of my university time. I'd had to move houses so many times. I think in 1 year I probably moved houses like 5 to 10 times. Because the sheer racism and discrimination I had to experience. There was one time I had a housemate that she tried to attack me, and I had to call the police, and she wrote me a sorry note, and I was made to move even though I didn't do anything. So it wasn't taken seriously by the authorities, even the police authorities or even the university. So it was a very, very difficult experience. And eventually I managed to come out of it, and I managed to graduate. And I did quite well given the circumstances of making it, making me quite unwell physically and mentally. I also had another situation there I'm going to talk about very, very briefly, that after university there was a couple of misunderstandings, and I'd again experienced homelessness, where I was denied access to my own house. That was a very, very difficult experience to go through. I wasn't given any help by the authorities, and I did have to sort of sofa surf a lot, just like, similarly with the university. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know where I was coming. And then the third situation and the fourth situation was where I had a fire, and I also had a flood in my house. This was after COVID. Well, actually, no, this was after COVID, but this was sort of still within COVID, sort of the lockdown times. There was no help and support for us as a family. My father had just passed away in December 2020. It was a very, very difficult experience. Again, we didn't have the health and support from the authorities. So it was a real struggle. We were sleeping on floors. We were living in and out of places and we were sort of with bin bags. We had our rent arrears. It was really, really difficult. I didn't get the support from the housing association or even the local council or even an insurance company. So It was a very traumatizing experience, and even until this day, we still as a family haven't fully recovered. We didn't even have any friends or family to help us, so it was very much a solo mission to be able to get through these issues. We probably spent a whole year not being able to come back to work because there were so many damages, repairs that hadn't been done. So even now, 2024, we still have a broken and damaged house, which still has not been repaired. So homelessness and discrimination, there has been a lot of that throughout this process, whether it's been from local authorities, whether it's been through the council, whether it's been through insurance companies. There is just racism and discrimination in so many aspects of these organizations. The higher you go, the worse it gets, and it's often like outward racism, or it's like indirect racism, subtle racism, whether it's through words, sentences, actions, emails, correspondence, whatever it is. It's almost like people can get away with it, and unless you put up a fight and take it all the way up to your MP, your councillor, your ombudsman, even then it's still really difficult. Even then, when I tried to go through those various processes, it was such a challenge. It was like they want to make it difficult for you to complain and raise your voice and talk about your experiences. So it takes a lot of willpower, mental health, strength to be able to go through a lot of these processes when you're in such a vulnerable, difficult situation yourself, and you're becoming physically and mentally ill from all of this. You know, I'd lost my job, my sister lost her job, we had many, many issues, my siblings dropped out of school. So it was such a difficult experience, and even now I still feel the after effects of the PTSD and the trauma of those experiences. And there's so many people around the country have these experiences throughout COVID and even post-COVID, where they went through similar experiences, being evicted, going through domestic violence, running away, not having the help and support from local authorities. And a lot of people do suffer with the after effects, the mental health, the PTSD from that. And actually, that is why so many people are having to rely on benefits, whether it's universal credit, PIP, disabled benefits, because they're not able to financially sustain themselves because they are so physically and mentally traumatized. It has an effect on their physical body to be able to function, because mental health and physical health is just as bad as each other and just has a profound impact on each other. But I know I'm conscious of time, so we'll go on to the next slide.
Well, Tam, thank you so much for sharing your story. Yeah, loads of comments coming up about how important it is to be able to hear that story. So thank you so much. And so I'm just going to move on to the next slide, where we were going to talk about some reflections. We're running a bit out of time, so I'm just going to focus on some really top line findings, sort of summary of the findings, and then invite Silong and Tam to talk about how their how homelessness and racism has been getting worse, and then I will invite Silong and Tam to talk about their experience and recommendations from the community research perspective on the next slide. So in terms of research findings, I think what I really take from the report itself is that the stories that were shared in interviews show us how people are facing and experiencing racism and racial discrimination at every point through their journey through the homelessness system. And that we already know that homelessness is complicated and traumatizing, and that the system doesn't work in so many ways. But the people who told their stories experienced this with the added pressure of racism, which is making the system work even less effectively for them. And so just to hand over to Silong to talk about homelessness and racism now, more recently, even since the research has been being done.
Can you hear me okay? I had to switch to my headphones.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
great. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll keep it really brief, but I guess just linking it, like the need for this research is something that is continued, and we've already seen like the kind of fascist attacks that were happening over the summer. That's not something that's went away, and we also need to be challenging like not just racism from fascists, but like racism within our own communities. So how is this being challenged in like the organizations that we work at, or like our own kind of interpersonal relationships, and kind of not seeing it as something that is separate, something that's over there, but seeing it as something that is everywhere. And this has had like such a big impact on things like homelessness, especially, like I have East Asian heritage, and what was happening over COVID with like the anti-Asian racism and like, I guess also kind of bringing different people into those like movements as well, because I think a lot of the time East and Southeast Asian experiences are overlooked because of the kind of idea of like the model minority and the myth of that as well. And Tam, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think I would say that, you know, we've seen in the world that there's been so many in the world today, there has been so many issues around Islamophobia, discrimination. You've seen different political parties that have been trying to be involved in the elections and stir up hate between British people and those of ethnic minority, even those that are from the Hindu background. They're being identified as Muslims when they're not actually Muslims, or even Sikhs because of their turban and the way of dress, and people sort of jewelry and symbolism and their sort of clothing. And it's been really difficult for all of our minorities, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, Hindu, you know, has been suffering and struggling because of the far right and the different political parties and the media headlines that you see in the various newspapers. And the you know, the situation is sort of Palestine and the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and all these different things have a big impact on the general public's mind. So that's why it's really, really important that when we do look at racism, discrimination, we take this with a pinch of salt, the outward sort of influences, and even sort of the refugee rhetoric that we have, that refugees are taking our jobs, ethnic minorities are taking our jobs, they need to go back home where they belong, and stuff like that is actually quite damaging to people's mental health well-being, and even to the younger generation. I'm seeing that there are trends of young people, you know, as young as, you know, in their infants or even in their teens, they're sort of being absorbed with this behavior from the older generation and from what they see on social media, like on TikTok and Instagram. As the social media movement grows, more and more younger people are going on social media, and they're being exposed to all this hatred and negative abuse. So I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that homelessness is getting worse, racism is getting worse. We as a society, as a community, as homelessness charities and organizations and advocates, we must play our part in defending and advocating for people that need the help and the support and that are maybe too vulnerable and not able to speak up for themselves.
Okay, thank you both so much. I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to move forward for Francesca to just wind up in the last minute.
Thank you. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing such kind of personal reflections. Obviously, that was a big part of the research we did, and it's been incredible to have you kind of as part of this webinar. And for everybody who's listening, the webinar was co-produced, and we couldn't have done it without Tam and Ceylon. So thank you. I also just want to acknowledge the content that we've been listening to. Please do look after yourselves, both in terms of people listening and also thinking about kind of how we move this forward. And there was a really good question at the beginning around how we resourced kind of reflective practice and support, and it was a big part of the project. And I suppose just in terms of whether there's other people on here thinking about kind of doing research like this, it was so powerful for it to be co-produced with kind of lived experience, but it also does require time and resources to do it properly and to make sure people are able to kind of get support as part of it as well. This is the first of 3 webinars, so we will also be looking at services in the next webinar, and that's very much about kind of solutions and how we can you know, move to a system where people are given support at the necessary points, and also with a view to prevention and thinking about kind of how we kind of make that as inclusive as we need to. And then we're also going to have a 3rd webinar on systems change and thinking around that kind of structural societal part of the solutions that has been very eloquently set out as part of the webinar. So just to say thank you so much, everybody. We've kind of put some links in the chat to different reports, both the report that we've published last month, but also other reports. And there has been some questions going on in the chat where we do have answers to those, including people asking for other resources. We'll kind of add those in. And yeah, just to say thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And again, thank you to my co-presenters, who we definitely couldn't have done this without. And I hope everybody has sort of given some reflections on this and thinking about kind of what we do to kind of stop this from happening in the future, and kind of what we can all do in terms of our own roles, both in our own communities and also in the organisations and roles that we work in.
Thank you all very much.